Welcome everyone to this webinar on building financial well-being and resilience in times of uncertainty. We're coming today to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, where I am, of the Kulin Nation, and I take this opportunity to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. Today we have a fascinating topic to discuss with you, which sits at the heart of everything that we are passionate about: physical, financial, and mental health and well-being, and the link, in this particular case, between financial well-being and having stable housing. So without much ado, I hand over to our wonderful director, Anna, to lead this webinar.
Thanks so much, Vinita. And I'm really excited about this session today. I think, as many of you may know, my passion for financial services, financial well-being, and our guests today have a really great foundation in this topic, and really on the topic of housing, but also essential workers and financial well-being and resilience, particularly in the current climate that we're in now. So I'll hand over to each of them to introduce themselves in more detail. But with us today is Tim Buskens, who is the CEO and founding director of Hope Housing, and Alex Hassall, who is the co-founder of Your Financial Wellness. Tim, I'll start with you. If you can introduce yourself in a little bit more detail and also tell us why you think financial well-being and resilience is an important topic for us to be discussing today.
Yeah, thank you, Anna, and thank you very much for inviting me along to participate in your webinar. I guess a little bit more about myself. My career has expanded over about 30 odd years now. It's kind of becoming a scary number for me, but it is what it is. And it has had the privilege of looking and being part of both public and private sectors within Australia and within financial services, state government, Victoria, regulator being with ASIC, and major financial institutions and wealth platforms and providers. I'm also very fortunate, going back to that 30-year number, winning, or kind of not quite winning as like my parents won, but I was pretty close to winning the lottery when I was born. Back in the early 70s, which put me in a very privileged position in terms of getting ahead on the conversation that we're having today and for future generations. But that enabled me to really develop a skill set and understanding around financial services and how that applies to people, not only throughout their working lives, but in retirement. And I really wanted a few years ago to take all that knowledge and expertise and founded and decided to start up a completely new company called Hope Housing, which was really focused on, and we'll get into it later, Anna, about how we support essential workers into home ownership, but really focused on utilising that skill and experience across a range of sectors to redesign and innovate the way the financial transaction works and the way that people can afford housing.
Excellent, and definitely keen to hear more about how Hope Housing and the great impact that's making. Alex?
Yeah, sure. So Your Financial Wellness is a platform that I co-founded, and it's designed to help people to better understand and improve their financial position. At the heart of it is something that we call the Your Financial Wellness Index, which we created and had validated by the University of New South Wales. And it's a reliable measure of somebody's perceived level of financial well-being. And what we established in doing that research was that there's a very strong correlation between financial well-being and financial literacy. So it's really important that people have a good understanding of their finances. But what it also means is that we've got a way to measure impact. So we can take a baseline and see what factors impact somebody's financial well-being. So to the work that Tim does, we know that housing is the single most correlated factor to financial well-being in Australia. I don't think that's any surprise, but that's a concern when you look at the issues that younger people are facing. So for individuals, the platform provides a confidential and personalised experience, and we distribute the platform through caring financial institutions. So it's our belief that financial institutions have a really important role to play when it comes to financial literacy and financial inclusion. But also what it means is that we're able to help financial institutions to better understand customers so that they can create products that better suit their needs. So I think we see our position as connecting the dots. We're empowering individuals to build confidence, but also giving institutions a deeper understanding of the way that they can engage with their customers.
Absolutely. And in terms of the impact of you partnering with different financial services organizations, for example, superannuation firms, what are the benefits to those partnerships, and how does this help improve financial resilience and well-being?
Yeah, sure. So I think that it, particularly for our member-owned organizations such as credit unions, mutual banks, it's moving beyond simply products, but also demonstrating that they've got real care for their members. It also, as I said, gives them unique insights to better understand the members and what their particular needs are. What we've also seen is that in terms of practical outcomes, people that utilize platforms like Your Financial Wellness and take an active interest in their finances, they report higher levels of financial well-being and higher levels of resilience, as well as higher levels of savings, which is actually contrary to some of the research that's out there that suggests that people that are using budgeting tools might be struggling. What we're finding is it's the opposite. It's the people that take an active interest and inquisitive and are wanting to improve their situation. They're naturally doing better than those people that aren't availing themselves of those tools. So we think that that's why it's really important that financial institutions, but also increasingly employers, encourage their customers or their staff to take an active interest in their financial situation.
That's an interesting point where, if you assume if someone's using a budgeting tool that maybe they're struggling and they're worse off, but actually the people who are taking that first step to access tools, go through that time-consuming process of listing out all my expenses, what's coming in, what's going out, that process is time-consuming. And I think that's also something that makes it really challenging when people, for example, are looking into buying a home, and then they start this whole process of really being confronted with their financial position, and then it feels potentially too hard. So it sounds like the platform, the YFW platform, is actually that first step in helping customers understand their situation, and then that means you can take steps to improve the situation, whether it's, I know now how much debt I have, therefore I can address that by paying a little bit extra on my credit card, or those kinds of behaviors. And is that something that you see when people actually take that first step to using the platform? You see them engaging more, or that score starts to change?
Yeah, we see that they're often, actually what we're finding is that customers and users will start with the platform. They enter information about how they feel about their financial situation, what their financial goals and aspirations are. We're not licensed to provide any financial advice, so we don't do that. We just simply provide education. But increasingly what we're finding is people are coming to us saying they're looking for help. Where do I go to get that guidance? So I think that there's a lot of talk about the need for financial institutions, particularly around superannuation, to provide more advice. But we think that education is actually the pathway to people recognizing that they might need help and seeking out that help.
Yeah, it's a really good starting point as well. You're seeing your financial position and then realizing that actually this will be useful to get some financial advice, or seek out the additional support to help with that, basically helping with outcomes.
We also see that people often vastly underreport what their expenditure is. So people, when they self-complete what their expenditure is, they're really underestimating just how much they're spending on discretionary items.
That doesn't surprise me at all. It's something that, when you are forced to look properly, it's kind of, oh, I assume I spend this much, and then usually it's kind of a best case where it's actually much more than you realize. It's kind of like answering a survey and putting forward the best version of yourself. There's we have a perception of our situation that I think contradicts the reality quite often. So I imagine with your financial wellness, when people are giving concrete, they're forced to really sit down and look at their credit card statement.
It's also really interesting seeing often we encourage people to complete this as a household, and seeing that um, in situations where a couple is doing it, that there can often be a discrepancy when it comes to financial goals and aspirations. So people haven't sat down and articulated what it is they want to achieve. And often that can be the catalyst for some interesting conversations in a household around, what it is they actually want to achieve.
And you mentioned aspirations and goals a little bit earlier as well. Is that something, do you see that home ownership is one of the standout goals that people have, or are there other goals as well that are standing out among different groups?
It is. So, the dream of home ownership, I think, is still alive, despite what a lot of people might say. Whether it's attainable is certainly another question. I think Tim is perfectly placed to address that. But something that's really interesting is that what we've seen recently is that younger cohorts, so people aged 20 to 26, are the most likely to report that their goal is to take the trip of a lifetime. So where that was previously what we saw in essentially pre-retirees, so people aged 50 plus, that's now a younger cohort. We're looking into why that is, but I think sort of intuitively it could be people starting to reference experiences over increasingly difficult to achieve goals, such as home ownership.
Yeah, that's an interesting finding in this point of time as well. The media really pushes hard the narrative of home ownership, and it's the Australian dream, but it's challenging, and young people are especially struggling. And I think that transitions us really nicely into asking Tim a couple of questions about Hope Housing. And it would be great to unpack and better understand the Hope Housing model. So as quite a unique organisation that has social impact at its core, it'd be great to hear from you regarding why Hope Housing was set up. I know you introduced that a little bit in the start, but a little bit more about, what it really is setting out to achieve and how that impact does contribute to these positive social impacts in the community and also among essential workers specifically.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. And that is really where our focus is, essential workforce. And I know before we jumped onto this webinar, we were sort of talking off camera, about the scary thought of, could a major capital city of Australia function without essential workforce residing within that city? And if you look at any census data, and you look at the red band of essential workers around the edge, it's sort of, you can see it already happening where everyone's getting pushed out and commuting 1 to 2 hours in. So I think that a couple of things I'd like to draw on. Why was Hope Housing established? Hope Housing was really established with a principle around home ownership, and I think we've sort of established, we've mentioned that already. But stripping it away, it was really thinking deeply about the financing transaction and how we actually buy homes. And the financing transaction that has been used and is commonly used today was actually designed 80 years ago in 1945, 80 years ago. And that was, through Menzies making a decision around, home ownership as a priority. And he wasn't alone. There were other major Western countries coming out of the war that were doing the same thing. Not all countries, but a lot of the major ones. That we really want to ensure that we increase levels of home ownership. At that time was about 50% home ownership rates. And, he started putting in practices that created the banking, the retail banking landscape and the framework that we see today. And that was essentially, okay, we will take a household, an individual. At the time, it was the husband that was working, the wife was at home. We'll take their income and we will determine based on that income how much debt we can provide or how much debt they can afford to purchase a home. And it worked very well for, probably about 40 or 50 of those, or even maybe 60 of those years. But what inevitably happened was the land values and the cost of building and the pressure of actually the how much does it cost to us, how much does it cost to buy that asset will continue to rise because it's finite resource. Demand will continue to rise because population's growing, whether it's natural or through immigration. And uniquely in Australia, we are centred around the coast in sort of 5 or 6 large cities that are geographically bound in one way or another. And so that financial model of how people bought homes, and Alex, I love the word they use, attainable is absolutely the word that we use here at Hope. The way they attain that asset through that financing transaction starts to break down. And what you see, and with Alex's innovating around the tools and supporting, what you see is people stretching themselves. They start to think, oh well, I don't really spend that much per week on groceries. I don't really spend that much per week on electricity and other utilities or streaming services or the like. And they push their debt limit because there's nowhere to room. There's nowhere to move on that. And so now we get to the situation where, and APRA is reporting these numbers, people work half a year to pay their bank before they pay themselves. Half a year. The servicing rates around debt are close to 50%. I think it's above 50% in Sydney. And where that really hits, I mean, that obviously, and we have other government programs out there for lower income groups, and there's the rental solutions and the like. But where that really hits is middle Australia. That people in the middle there, an average income's around $100,000 or so, where it currently sits, are the ones that hurt the most. And the large population of that middle of Australia is essential workforce. They're people, the teachers, the nurses, the firefighters, the ambulance drivers, the people that we really need to be on their A game. A large representation of middle Australia get pushed out. Or if they don't get pushed out, they're in rental accommodation, which is inadequate. And where Alex is doing an immense job to support, they're stressed out. We've stretched our income to an absolute max. It's not just a husband working, that's a wife working. They may have 2 jobs, and that will impact their ability to do their job. So we sort of we've took the view that we really need to think about that financing transaction. And what we need to do to tackle that financing transaction is work out a way to actually reduce the debt burden. And actively what Hope is doing is setting up the shared equity model, which is effectively saying, okay, we need to think about another capital flow in terms of how somebody's going to purchase that asset. And that capital flow is not a landlord model. It's not, I'm going to rent that, that traditional model, because home ownership, and we'll probably get to a little bit more of this, and you've already touched on it, home ownership and the system in Australia, the pension system, the tax system, is all centered around the fact that you own your home at retirement. And I can't remember the stat off the top of my head, but I think it's a huge stat where if you enter into retirement and you don't own your own home, you're very likely to be in poverty in that retirement phase. So we're saying, okay, we need to think about how we bring new, fresh capital into that asset, but at the same time, ensure there's ownership rights for that essential workforce. and ensure their debt burden is reduced, and that will have a whole lot of flow-on impacts, which we'll get into around financial well-being. But ensure that there is a realistic pathway where they can get to 100% home ownership. And the shared equity model, which we didn't invent shared equity. It's been around for a while. But what we did is we looked at it deeply, we brought our financial expertise, we turned it upside down, and we innovated shared equity to ensure that fundamentally the debt burden in that transaction is actually reduced. And there is a real pathway for people to progressively buy us out, repay the equity that we've provided them into that home ownership. And that starts to practically, what does that actually mean? And this is where we work well with Alex and what he's doing. Practically what that means is it immediately moves people's servicing of that home from an unattainable 50% of my wage, my household income, is going to pay off debt. So for half the year I'm working for the bank, moves it from that to 30% less goes to servicing that debt. And just in that 20% slice, that brings that amount of money back into the household budget. And then they can sit down with Alex and they can think about how they utilize that, how they budget that. That brings it back into that budget, but it also gives them a real shot at enabling that home ownership. And if I may, I'll just use one practical example. And I was talking to one of the first people we helped was Sophie, a nurse, a single nurse in her 20s. She came to us and she had a bank loan from one of the majors. I won't name them, but she came to us with a bank loan from one of the majors, and one of the majors said to her, based on your income, we will give you $600,000 of debt. She had only about 40 to 50,000 in savings. So she was in that range of 650,000 of, this is my financing. And that 600,000 would have meant that she was working half the year for that bank. She was commuting from Newcastle. That's where her parents were, and she was working at St. Vincent Hospital. She was micro sleeping. She works in the ICU. Anna, could you imagine? You're working in like this major city hospital in a critical element of that hospital, and you're almost falling asleep in your car on your way to work and back. And I said to her, why don't you do rental? Well, because sometimes my hours were so crazy, I can't have flatmates. It's crazy. That was gone off the table for her. But she's looking around in a city for 650,000. There's just nothing that she gets. So we took Sophie in, we introduced her to our partner bank. Immediately we said that debt has to reduce, and we would only allow 450K of debt for Sophie. She's now doing less than 30%. So that's the first piece. More money is in her budget, in her pocket, and we start the path of financial well-being. And Vinita sort of introduced it perfectly, where yes, there's a financial element, but there's also a productivity and a mental health and a physical health element. So we reduced her debt, we enabled her to utilize her savings, and then we provided her with equity. And now she owns an apartment, a 2-bedroom apartment, about 15-minute commute to her work. She rides a bike. So that's a physical element, Vinita, where, you were talking about into work rather than micro sleep in the car. And she can have real conversations now with Alex and his team around, how she thinks about that budget. So there's people like Sophie now that are on the pathway to home ownership. And she has been with us for 2 years, and she started to pay us back. So, we have a conversation with her every year, and this is where we also go through the budgeting element. We have a conversation with her every year, as well as other essential workers we support. And we say, okay, that property that you've owned has gone up 5, 10, some of them have gone up 15%, even in that 2-year time frame. And that's great for you, but you've just given us 15% free kick. That could have been in your pocket. So, there's a conversation, an educational conversation, because like Alex, we can't provide advice, but there's an educational conversation saying, well, how do you now progress that home ownership to go from 50% or whatever however that split looked at the start, to 100%, and do that in bite-sized chunks very frequently. It's budgeting 101, enabling them to attain that home, not only at the start, but 100% over the life of that loan. So it's kind of like, Alex and I were sort of like looking at this challenge from two different perspectives. One is, let's get to the heart of the financial product and really innovate that, and really think about how do we pull it apart. An 80-year-old product we're still utilizing to purchase, our major asset, housing, a major asset, an 80-year-old product. There's been tweaks to it, but it hasn't really changed. And that product over time moved from 50% debt to now about 90-95%. I think I've even seen people financing homes 100% debt. That's crazy. So how do we really get into the heart of that product, and then work with Alex and his team to say, well, how do we then provide them with a platform to educate, to help them think about the broader implications of financial well-being. You can't just do one. You can't just educate someone and they're stuck because 50% of their income is going to the banks, and they're just getting pushed out further. So you can't just do that, but you can't also equally just, okay, we'll change the product, but how are you actually going to utilize now that additional money in your budget to really think about financial well-being?
There's some really great themes there. And I think that the thing that I love the most about that is through so many positive flow-on benefits that tie in with financial well-being. As you mentioned, it's being able to be more productive, spending less time commuting, less risk of the commute being so long for our most critical workforce, but also her mental health, the benefits there of owning that property, but also her future outcomes as well, her retirement outcomes, her super, there's all these flow-on benefits, as you mentioned, since the system is set up to focus on home ownership. And it's, it seems so clear and sensible in the way you describe it, but it's quite a unique approach. And I think your point about productivity is really interesting. And Alex, I know we've had conversations about financial well-being and productivity. Did you have any comments you wanted to make on that topic?
Yeah, well, I think that there's an established link between financial well-being and mental health. And we think that there is a strong correlation also between financial stress and reduced productivity. But we actually did a deep dive into it. And we found it really difficult to find the hard data that demonstrates, what impact is financial stress having on workplace productivity. So that's actually something that we're now talking to a university to set up a program to actually deep dive into that and understand what the productivity implications are. Because I think, from a government standpoint, improving financial literacy, improving financial inclusion is really, really important. And we think that, given that there's all this talk about productivity measures, we think that there's a role that government can play in supporting organizations, be it employers or financial institutions, to improve financial literacy, improve financial well-being. But what we want to do is take a really academic approach to understanding what impact financial literacy education has, and see what it can do to lift productivity. Because I think, to the point Tim made, somebody that's at work worrying about meeting necessary living expenses is not necessarily somebody that's fully focused on their task. And that can have safety implications, but also simple productivity implications as well.
Yeah, and particularly if we think about the essential worker group in even more focus, that has these greater flow-on effects with making mistakes. People in hospitals or police officers or all these essential workers being stressed, having mental health implications, and then that causing declined productivity because of the finances which tie in with their physical health, their mental health. It's all intertwined, and I think as we've been kind of talking through, there's really clear benefits to people understanding their position, but then also there's unique shared equity models and ways to approach it so that it's not your full paycheck going towards the home, because you can buy a home and you tick that box, but then paying the home becomes your whole focus, and then you're still thinking about it at work. To your point, Alex, you've achieved the thing that we're trying to achieve, but the consequence to that is the relationship pressure, the household pressure, the mental health pressure. So interesting, the concept that Tim, you've been mentioning around reducing the amount of debt to still get the asset. And I'd be interested to know, we're in quite a unique scenario or climate at the moment. We have post-pandemic, we know essential workers were particularly impacted because they basically just had to keep working in such a incredibly stressful and high-risk time. And then there's now additional challenges with housing affordability, house prices, cost of living pressures, which eat into people's ability to save money, but also their expenses going up. Are you seeing this reflected in the number of people who are in your wait list? And are there these kinds of, are you noticing changes compared to a few years ago or longer?
Yes, I mean, look, we don't do advertising. We haven't gone and sort of marketed what we do, but I've got over 3,000 now essential workers sitting on the wait list, through word of mouth, through the sort of the old water cooler conversations, through engagement with their various unions and other, because obviously essential workers are probably one of the most heavily unionized workforce. There is, and you ask Alice a question, and we ask the same question. Is home ownership still a goal? And absolutely is a goal. And it should be, because the system is skewed towards home ownership. If you don't get to retirement and have a stake in a residential property, and pay that off, you are a lot worse off from a tax and a wealth perspective. That's just the nature. Now we've got to be able to buy, and we've got to think about rental solutions, and there's got to be all these other innovations, and that's important. But it's not going to replace the importance of home ownership. And I don't see a future. I don't see a government that's going to tackle the big hairy goals of tax reform and pension reform and all the other things that are necessary to actually alleviate the inherent desire for home ownership. And then, I think Vinita mentioned, that the safety and security that creates. But I'll just go back a couple of steps as well, if I may, Anna, about productivity. Because when we started to think about shared equity and breaking apart the financial transaction and really innovating, a financing arrangement that has been in place for 80 odd years, that's close to breaking. Well, it has broken for Middle Australia. I mean, it broke for lower income Australia a long time ago, unless you live out in the bush. But in the city, it's breaking pretty much for Middle Australia now, and it will continue. And it'll really only be the traditional model will only be available to that sort of white collar, highly paid group or that class. But if I could sort of go back to another point, when we started to design the shared equity, we started to think, okay, effectively got a blank piece of paper here. And how do we think about impact? And you've already mentioned it, so I won't go back through, the productivity, the mental health, and the like. But how do we think about the wellness and the impact? What's the flow-on effect it has for the future generations? When we're feeling more secure, when we feel more happy about ourselves and our financial situation, we make different decisions. Not just about ourselves or how much money we're going to be spending on, this streaming service or that consumable good, but how we're going to educate our children. How are we thinking about schooling? How are we thinking about healthcare? How do we think about supporting ourselves? How do we think about going to the dentist? No one likes going to the dentist, but how do we feel about those sort of things? And those decision makings have massive flow-on impact to the family unit. How do we think about giving back into the community? Do we volunteer more? Do we spend more time in that family unit to support our children through education? And we do see, and we had the Centre of Social Impact that's embedded in the University of New South Wales help us think through this, but we do see that broader behavioural change, and we've captured that in our impact reports. We're about to publish our third report. And Alex, I'll make sure that I'll send you a copy of this because it goes to something you said. We're now starting to look at information coming out of Melbourne Uni and the Hilda data and how people think about through Hilda their own position, and we benchmarked our essential workforce and those people we supported to home ownership. And it kind of probably doesn't work well on the video, Anna, but if you think about a scale, this area is really good, this area is not that great. Hilda's basically saying most of Australia, pick your measure, is about here. Essential workforce in Sydney was somewhere down here. And now what we've seen with the people we've helped, they're here. So, you just see that, and you see that behavioural change occurring. And there's one other thing before I pause and hand back, but not only that's helping people now, what about the future generations that, and I sort of skimmed over through my background, but I've got three kids, three boys, in teenage, all teenagers. My eldest has just started to go into university. There was a conversation I had with him last year about, well, what are you going to do, mate? What course are you going to go into? And I had to really check myself because I could see I was pushing into business or finance or law, not because that was his passion, but that was as a father saying, well, mate, I don't see a teacher being able to afford. So you've got to get into. So we're starting to steer people away from these professions, and kids inherently are starting to steer people away from professions. I have conversations with the unions and with the employers. They struggle, to get people into wanting to take up nursing, wanting to take up these really challenging jobs because it's going to be really difficult for them to live. So we've got to be thinking about where that workforce is coming from, and we can't just bring it in from overseas. There will be a role for that to play for sure, but we've got to be thinking about the people that are here and the next generations, and ensuring that we've got the ability. So not just the productivity of people here now, but it's that productivity of ensuring the workforce expands, and those next generations are coming in.
I just think something that that occurred to me as well, Tim, is that we look at the gender disparity when it comes to financial well-being, and consistently women report lower levels of financial well-being than men. And it strikes me, we work with a number of financial institutions, one of whom's got represents essential workers, that, essential workers in nursing, teaching are going to be female dominated. So there's also that gender issue as well.
Absolutely. And it was interesting though, just a little story, Alex. A friend of mine recently had a baby, and they went to Randwick, and she knew what I was doing, and so she was very attuned to this, and she noticed in the maternity ward there were two types of nurses: really older generation and fresh out of school. And she asked the question, where are the 30-year-olds? Where are the 40-year-olds? And they said, well, they've gone to Wollongong, they've gone to Newcastle, they've gone out to our room. We can't get them here. So there's this gutting that occurred because that female workforce is saying, well, we're challenged as it is, and we need to move out to rebalance ourselves. We've got no other option. There is no option. So what's going to happen in Randwick when the older generation retires? Are we going to have a situation like we have in Sydney Central Police Station? And this is real, happening right now. The average level of expertise in the Central Sydney Police Station is 18 months. 18 months. Major capital city, world city in Sydney is got 18 months experience at the Central Sydney Police Station. Why is that? Because out of Goulburn, they all come in and they're required to do their first gig in a metropolitan police station, and obviously Sydney's the largest. After 3 years, they've got their option to go anywhere. Pretty much they all go somewhere else. And so, and that, I know you mentioned about the female demographic, but there's an example from a male perspective where, that experience of major capital city, 18 months is what our police force has available to them.
It's such a
Scary thought.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting how housing really sits at the heart of a lot of this. Alex mentioned at the start that we're seeing a shift in the data set for people saying that their goal is the trip of a lifetime. So overseas travel being more aspirational. And I wonder if part of that is because housing just feels so unattainable. And for the essential workers, they go to Goulburn, they work in Sydney for a little bit, but they know they potentially perceive they can't live there. So it's potentially not even something that they're exploring because it just feels way too hard. And you look at the data for home, affordability for housing, and it's very clear which areas are more expensive. And the media really pushes this as well in terms of the most expensive suburbs, how much these houses are selling for. But if it doesn't feel achievable, then talent retention becomes even more challenging. And I've heard similar around the oldest demographic of healthcare workers versus the youngest, and missing this mentoring and support for this middle group who can help the youngest generation want to stay in these roles. And especially with things like teachers, what they have to go through and what they're facing, and the support that is needed from other staff and other essential workers. But it becomes really, really challenging, and when they're not able to at least secure the house and have less of a commute and take off that pressure, sounds like it ties in with so many broader wellness benefits, including financial, but of course all the others that we mentioned as well.
Absolutely. And again, I just go back and I repeat, you just can't do one side of that solution. You got to think deeply about the financial product and how we innovate and evolve that. Major institutions and governments have innovated the way they finance big infrastructure projects. That's occurring. That's alive. And it happens, I think, we had the Hawke Keating government start that program, picked up by Howard and Costello, to innovate, but it hasn't really happened at that house level. But you can't just have that, which is what we're delivering. You need the Alexes of the world and the innovation that he's doing to think about, well, how do you support people through our program? Because there's a whole bunch of other things to really consider around your finances, and how you utilize that and how you think about that. And you've got to bring those two together. Financial well-being doesn't just occur because you're well educated, or because you're able to obtain a home that you can afford. It occurs when those things come together, and you deeply think about wealth, and how that flows through attracting talent, educating children, thinking about healthcare, thinking about looking after yourself, thinking about volunteering in the community, so on, so on, so on.
I think there's also something that's missed. What we found in our research was that people with higher levels of financial well-being are actually more valuable customers to financial institutions. So that there's actually a profit motive for financial institutions to get it right.
Yeah, and I think there's some clear themes around the need for innovation and disrupting a model that Tim has very clearly explained needing to change. Society has changed a lot since that model was set up, and there's ways in which what Alex is doing in terms of helping people understand their financial position, and then Tim, what you've described around changing the model so that home ownership is achievable and the debt takes up less of someone's finances, which then means they can contribute to the economy by spending money on things that aren't just their debt. They can support their family, they can be present in their household, which then helps with the future generation as well, which is, their kids growing up to, hopefully some will aspire to be essential workers because we need that workforce. But if people don't want to do these roles because they can't achieve their goals, it's too stressful, they know they have to commute a few hours, we're going to have some serious challenges increasingly in probably the near future. So I think that the work both of you are doing really is tying in with some really important outcomes, and I think that's a great place to leave our discussion today. And I'll hand back over to Vinita to conclude, but thank you both for sharing so clearly and articulate in terms of exactly how these initiatives really make a difference and how this will flow through to positive impacts for both individuals and the community.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you, Anna. And Tim, Alex, as always, I'm in awe whenever I speak to the two of you, just looking at the way in which you've so clearly articulated that essential link that we are always highlighting, and looking at the different aspects of your business model. So, Tim, I absolutely love the fact that you've managed to innovate a product, as you say, as a longtime banker. Home loans are the bedrock of everything that you do from a personal banking situation. So the fact that you've managed to innovate and create shared equity, which is supporting so many workers, is absolutely fabulous. And, Alex, on the other side, as Tim is saying, it needs to then be also supported through financial education, better management of your finances, and taking active role in it, agency. So I absolutely love both aspects of that. Also, Tim, you talked about how this can actually impact future generations. And Anna and myself have been talking to psychologists who are working in schools with very young children and in aged care with much more older Australians. And both of them have talked about the workforce and the shortage of the workforce that's available to meet these growing needs. So, I think that this is a factor that maybe hasn't been highlighted enough. And I hope that this global audience that these webinars provide, people can take note. And I'd like to end, Alex, with your insight, which also feeds into what Tim was saying, that financial institutions have a strong business case for supporting both of these aspects, because it'll lead to better customer decisions being made, which in the future will support them. So thank you so much. That's been a fabulous experience. Thank you for sharing your insights.
Thanks
very much.
Thanks, Vinita.